Okay, welcome to my fourth iteration here of church history. We began with the world Jesus was born into, then we had the age of the gospel and the apostles, the 100s, and we are now entering into the 3rd century or the 200s. Sorry while I adjust technically here. Phone technology being what it is. All right, the 200s. Our major trends here, the dominant trends of the 200s, the persecution of Christians. Obviously, again, this began right away, and I'm covering different centuries, but persecution in the 200s and into the 300s becomes a key element here. The decline of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire hit its height at the end of the 1st century, and throughout the 200s, we're going to see the declines creep in. Partly on account of that, the rise of monasticism. And then finally, the rise of the Fathers. And the Fathers is a very particular term here of figures who arise who become defenders of the faith. And I'll cover that more when I get to it. All right. The persecutions. The persecutions began as soon as Jesus was born. He was persecuted by Jewish authorities and finally put to death. He predicted his disciples would suffer the same fate. The Emperor Nero began the Great Fire of Rome on the 18th of July of 64 AD. He blamed the Christians, and so began the public sanctioned persecution of Christians would last for about 300 years. It goes on longer than that, but as far as this, you have other groups come in which persecute throughout the centuries, but this is a very concentrated particular persecution. Persecution had several characteristics. First of all, they were not rational. They were often very personal. Christians were not lawless people. They paid their taxes. They obeyed the laws as long as they were moral. They were loyal citizens of whatever country they belonged. So there was no good reason to persecute them. Most persecutions were personal. A young woman would spurn a man's request for her hand or something else. He would denounce her as a Christian. If I can't have her, no one will. And they would persecute her. Two men were up for preferment in the military or politics. One would denounce the other as a Christian to get the preferment. It became a means of getting after somebody. Normally, when someone was accused of being a Christian, they were interrogated, and often, if they were willing to acknowledge the emperor as divine and give a nod or perhaps a pinch of incense, there needs to be a space that there is not, to the gods of Rome, nobody really cared. This was where the conundrum occurred. Many a Christian just went along and acknowledged the emperor to save their life. This practice was condemned by the church. Last time I covered the Donatists, which again become an increasing problem as centuries go along, which stated that if you did that, you had left the faith and could not be readmitted back to baptism. You had left the faith permanently. Anyone who offered incense to the emperor was considered to have fallen or lapsed in their faith. If someone refused to offer incense to the emperor and acknowledge the gods of Rome, they were considered a traitor and unpatriotic. The level of torture punishment varied. So when it really came down to how much, oftentimes, and funny, and I'll go into this a little bit, but there's a number of stories of a person initially is persecuted as a Christian and won't recant, and they're going to just torture them a little bit, and then they throw a fit, or they begin screaming and yelling about how everybody should become a Christian, so the punishment gets worse. Or the one they'll have that are especially funny is where a young woman will be denounced as a Christian, or even men. You have some of the early bishops will be denounced, and they're being tortured, and they're so patient and forgive their torturers and are so constant, their torturers convert and become Christians, which means someone has to torture all of them now, and they'll start torturing, and then they see how patient they are, and you'll end up with 200 or 300 people, all of them were converted successively by the fact that the Christian they were torturing forgave them, didn't hold a grudge, bore their sufferings patiently, and they were so moved by their consistency that they convert themselves. And there's stories like that. They have what they call a martyrology. You can see the Latin one there, the English one. It became a book which chronicled the sufferings of the martyrs. Some of them are horrific. Some of them are actually kind of funny, which really isn't nice. And some of them you can really see how, again, it was a very localized thing. It was almost never, and there'll be an exception which I will get to, almost never a systematic, all Christians must die. It just didn't happen because, again, why would you kill your tax base? Why would you kill people who were otherwise good citizens? It really became a matter of this person is causing a problem for an authority, this person is well known or what have you, and it becomes an embarrassment, and so they persecute them. A couple of entrances. He says, at Marseille, the holy soldier Victor, who refused to either perform military service or to offer sacrifice to idols, therefore he was cast into prison, where he was visited by an angel, then punished with divers torments, and lastly broken in the flour mill, and so finished his testimony. On the same day, the holy martyrs Trophimus and Theophilus, one of the Emperor Diocletian, were stoned and burned, and last beheaded, and so crowned with martyrdom. In Bulgaria, very many holy martyrs, whom the profane Emperor Nicephorus, when he was wasting the churches of God, caused to be slain by diverse sorts of death, and sword, by rope, by arrows, by long imprisonment and hunger. You can see, if it's individual people who, again, oftentimes if a local ruler was losing control of the local government, persecuting Christians was a good way to, it's all their fault, and make himself look better. At Tyro, a sea which had formerly stood on an island in the lake of Bolsena in Tuscany, in the persecution under Diocletian, the Holy Virgin and Martyr Christina. She brake her father's idols of gold and silver and gave the morsels to the poor, whereupon he commanded her to be torn with stripes and otherwise fearfully tortured, after which a great stone was tied about her neck and she was cast into the lake, but an angel delivered her. Then she then suffered bravely the sharpest torments, and under the judge who succeeded her father, and the end finished the course of her testimony under the President Julian, having endured a burning furnace, where she remained shut up unhurt for 5 days, having by Christ's power overcoming serpents, and having had her tongue cut out, and lastly being dealt with swords. You can see how graphic some of these get. Really, the individual cruelty of someone. What they would do is they begin torturing, and they wouldn't be hurt. They cast her into a furnace, and she comes out a little while later unhurt, and they get even madder and madder. And sometimes it gets to the point of guys, can't you see this is something, reminds you of the Pharisees who are trying to plot against Jesus to kill him, even though they can see there's clearly something divine behind him. At Antioch, the holy Augusta, perfect Artemius, who had been distinguished for the highest military service under Emperor Constantine the Great, but when he rebuked the Emperor Julian the Apostate for his cruelty toward Christians, Julian commanded to be cudgeled and tortured and beheaded. Right? In ancient Gaul, the holy monarch Capricius, who had escaped from the fury of persecution, was lying hid in a cave. When he heard how the blessed faith, the virgin faith, was suffering for Christ's sake, he was stirred up to bear witness, suffering likewise. And he prayed the Lord, and if he be judged worthy of the glory of martyrdom, he would cause a spring of clear water to break forth from the rock of the cave. When the Lord granted such a thing, Capricius went back and confidently to the field of battle and gained the crown of martyrdom by noble contention. It's actually, again, you'll see this regularly, where somebody will initially run away and then hear of all these martyrs are bravely, and they feel like, oh my God, what am I doing in here? And go back out there and get killed. Or they will again there say, oh Lord, I don't want to go, but if you want me to go and this miracle happens, I'll go. And then it happens. And they're like, oh, okay, I guess God wants me out. So there's any number of stories of people who would normally have run away and hid were comforted by either, again, meeting someone who was a Christian and suffering patiently, or by having some sign from God. In Rome, under the Emperor Mark Antoine, Antonine, the holy martyrs Ptolemy and Lucius, of these was recorded by Justin Martyr that Ptolemy brought a lewd woman to believe in Christ and taught her the honor of chastity, for which cause he was accused by an unclean man before Ubicius the prefect. He suffered long and foul imprisonment, at last made a public confession of Christ's teaching, and was sentenced to death. Lucius blamed the sentence and openly avowed himself to be a Christian, for which case he was sent to death likewise with him, and with them was sent a third under the same condition. So you can see here, he converts a woman who's a lewd woman, probably a prostitute, and all of her clients are like, wait a minute, no. So yeah, they end up torturing him. The blood of martyr was the seed of Christians. The persecutions did not stem the faith. In fact, it tended to grow. They used to say that the areas when they saw the patience of Christians and them being put to death, oftentimes would actually believe, it would increase the faith. There's a famous scene of Emperor Nero having a feast, and on the right-hand side there, those are Christians wrapped up in basically beef-soaked cloth, and they light it on fire, and they were the torches that kept the evening, that lighted up the evening. Thrown into the arena with the gladiators, oftentimes in animal pits. The idea of the persecution of Christians was for a time, and again in various eras, where it was beneficial to the person involved, and it would be seen popularly, could be very virulent. The famous one of the Christians being thrown to the wild beasts. Ignatius of Antioch speaks, and we talked about last time, this bishop who was going to be taken from Antioch to Rome, and on the way he writing epistles saying, "Stay fast in your faith. Don't come save me. You know, I'm going to give my life for Christ. I will be ground up as purebred for the Lord by these beasts. Do not come and save me. My life is a testimony." So you see this over and over again. The constancy, patience, and forgiving of the people who are persecuting them ends up creating for the Christians. So part of this, what was causing this persecution and this kind of behavior, was the fact the empire was in decline. When you read about the decline of the Roman Empire, you almost think you're reading a newspaper from nowadays. A lot of the same things that are happening today were happening back in the Roman Empire. The opulence, the people who having money, disregarding the poor, disregarding their fellow citizens, staying very up, opulent feasts, that kind of stuff. This is a famous a painting called The Flowers of Heliogabalus, who was an emperor toward the end. And they had a big feast day, and he had a cloth that was pinned to the ceiling. And when he pulled the cord, it dropped, and all these petals fell on it. It became a symbol of kind of the opulence of toward the end of Rome. The 200 saw a steep decline in morals, social ethos, and political acumen. There was no ruling family in Rome. The title of Caesar and later Augustus was open to anyone who could take control and hold Rome. We saw this when Julius Caesar entered Rome as a conquering hero, but was killed by the Senate a few days later. Octavian established the empire, becoming the first Augustus, a year or so before our Lord was born. But by the year 100, cracks were forming. By the 200s, potential Caesars were killing each other for the office, only to be replaced or killed a few days later by another rival. 200 saw a very, very fast succession of Caesars who would come in there. Either people who had raised up as the aristocracy, felt they deserved it, would show up, but they really weren't competent, or generals who were ambitious and thought they could hold it, would come in, would hold Rome, and then another rival faction would come in. Poisonings and chalices, stabbings were very common throughout the 200s. Politically, it was a very, very unstable time. Personal ambition and the neglect of public good caused many to cease to trust in the government. The wealthy began to flaunt their wealth, while those in the outskirts of the empire became disillusioned by the idea of Rome and its empire, and they ceased to be loyal. There was a real lack of confidence, lack of military. One of the reasons in the next century you're going to see they begin bringing in the Germans and the other tribes to fill in the ranks of the military, because no one wanted to be in the military anymore. It was much easier just to enjoy themselves and not have to take up arms and go out there and fight for it. So you see increasingly the photo there, which is for much, much later, the idea of just the pleasure yachts and just the opulence and pleasure and wealth that was Rome, but it was not being, young men and young women were not dedicating themselves to protecting and helping Rome to survive. This is an interesting map. The map here is, you can see the areas in pink, which were the senatorial provinces, the wealthier areas, and the green were the outskirts, and the gray is client states, which is very small at this point. But you can see how toward the center of it was where all your senators lived, and in the green you can see the areas which were the outskirts, which increasingly became fell into disuse. They weren't being taken care of. If you wanted to have an enjoyable life, you moved into the pink areas and were taken care of. If you lived in the green areas, chances are you would find there would not be the services, the military would not be as good, you would not have, the roads would not be kept up, the aqueducts would not be, you saw this, it was kind of like when they say either a tree dies or someone dies, you'll see all the sap or all the blood pulls to the center, and the extremities begin to suffer. You had this with Rome. The extremities began to suffer as the people with the money were holding on to it and keeping it toward the center. The crisis of the 3rd century, also known as the military anarchy or the imperial crisis, which is like mid to later 200, was a period in which the Roman Empire nearly collapsed. The crisis ended due to military victories of Aurelian and the ascension of Diocletian as implementations of the reforms of 284. Diocletian implemented a number of reforms designed to save the Roman Empire. He divided up the empire into smaller districts, based mostly on language, but also on economic and military concerns. He revitalized Roman culture. This included the cults of Roman gods. Any dissent was met with ferocious retribution. This is the one time when it actually became official to persecute Christians. Diocletian saw the empire collapsing, and he said, we need to be Roman again. Rome, the glory of Rome, Roman gods. If you worship a foreign god, you are not Roman, and you are out. And this began really full scale, because again, the empire is struggling socially, so they wanted to reinforce it. So they began to sanction anyone who wasn't Roman. Even you had what was the can't think of it right now. Freddie Mercury belonged to that same religion. If you're a Freddie Mercury fan, Zoroastrian. Thank you. And I figured you'd know that. So yes. Any of these things that weren't Roman, we're going to be persecuted. Now, the Zoroastrian is not likely to defend his faith. They're like, yeah, okay, Rome. I'll be Zoroastrian at home and Roman abroad. Christians can't do that again, all right? There's a whole fight over you have to stand it to be Christian. And so some of the greatest persecutions happened to Diocletian. Again, the odd thing is that what he was trying to do was save an empire by going back to the glory of its ancient days. What he was really doing was basically digging himself a hole in history as being a horrible person. Here's the breakup of Diocletian. This happens before the Christians really have Rome. This is not something that Constantine did or whatever. This is Diocletian. This is the 200s. The idea, you can see the 3 districts here. The district up the, wow, that's a lot taller than I thought it was going to be. It kind of chips the top off there. Anyway, the district of Constantius as Caesar, the yellow, the blue, which is going to be your Latin, and the purple, which is going to be your Greek. You can see it broken into kind of the linguistic system. So basically your Celts, Galilee and Britain is going to be your Celtic area. You're going to have your Latin area, Spain, Africa, and Italy. And you're going to have your Greek area, which is kind of your Middle Europe there, and your Egypt and your what comes the Fertile Crescent and later on Byzantium or Constantinople. You can see there, and this was built so that they could manage smaller areas. You had your own government, you had your own official. Interesting fact, which isn't pertinent right now, but will be next time, was Constantine, who becomes the first Christian Roman Empire, is a Western empire, and he was militarily was stationed in the West, but once he becomes emperor, he moves to the East, and people wonder why. What they had at this period in time was you had the son, so you had 2 Augustus and 2 Caesars. They would send the eldest son to the opposing camp, so that if anybody did anything wrong, he had your son. He could kill him. So it was to make sure that the other side didn't do anything that was unjust, because the son was living in the opposite side. So Constantine grew up in Byzantium speaking Greek. So he actually spoke Greek as well as Latin, perhaps better, because when he becomes emperor, he moves the capital to the east. That isn't for another 100 years or so. But anyway, you can see the breakup there under Diocletian. The social decline of Rome led many people to begin to realize that the world was not a place a Christian could live comfortably in. And the idea of seeking a world where they could live out their faith more in a dedicated fashion began to rise. And this rise of monasticism, of being alone with God and separating yourself to live a more spiritual life, really began to grow at this point in time. Seeing the societal decay, chaos and disorder, many fled the decadent cities. They found solace in the Egyptian desert, and they're called desert fathers and mothers. Their lives were ones of asceticism, prayer and fasting. They sought spiritual wisdom and closeness or union with God. This union was fraught with struggle against the devil. This area here in Egypt, here you can see it begins about probably almost the end of the year 100, but 200 is really the year when it really grows. Began when they began colonizing this area around the Nile and the area up here. And you can see upper right quadrant there. You can see the number of these groups of monks grows and grows, and it ends up going way down into Egypt. And they said there were whole cities of these men, and sometimes women tended to stay in houses that were closer to more closer to cities, where the men would head off in the middle of nowhere and live these lives of asceticism out in the desert there, living on very, very little. By the end of the 200s, you can see that all along the Nile there is populated with all these things of men who probably look very much like that. Long hair and long beards. They became almost like wild men. In fact, St. John the Baptist was a very popular icon with these men who went off and lived like this. But it became just, again, whole cities would grow up around these men living these very austere lives of prayer and such out in the desert. St. Anthony of the Desert was one of the first to flee to the desert and lived alone as a hermit. There's a famous saying that he wasn't sure what to do, and he went to Mass one day, and the priest got up and read the gospel, which said, take no, go on, take no, do not take no shirt, no staff, no clothes, go. I don't remember the whole thing. Take off, and he heard this as speaking to him, and he went off in the desert and lived alone, and talked about, like birds bringing them food sometimes, which is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but they might have some passing whatever would give them basic nutrition, so they could live these lives alone. During his time alone, he was tempted by demons. They appeared in all sorts of horrible forms, and he was assaulted both physically and spiritually, but in the end he triumphed. It's a fascinating book if you ever want to read some like wow, kind of early hagiography, is The Temptations of St. Anthony. I think St. Basil wrote it. It talks about what he went through. For initially, he was just tempted spiritually, and later on, they're like setting his bed on fire and knocking him around and beating him up and everything because he was hanging out. How true of this is hard to know. It certainly is. Other monks in other centuries will talk about the difficulty of trying to overcome one's natural desires and be more spiritual. But it's a very famous story and very possibly true. But St. Anthony was really the first one, the most popular one. After many years alone, his disciples began to approach him, and he lived near him. It was called a skete, a collection of little huts around a church. They studied, worked, and ate alone, but came to the church to worship. Basically, having someone with some spiritual wisdom nearby was a good thing. A lot of people who ran off didn't stay very long, or they would initial fervor run in the desert, and after a while they realized that it wasn't nearly as much fun as they were hoping it was going to be, and they would walk back into things. And you talk when we get to St. Benedict in a couple hundred years from now, he'll go and he'll talk about the different kinds of monks and the struggles the monks went through. But in this case, St. Anthony, they began to gather around him, around the central church in a skete. Now, when I give you the definition for the next kind of monastery, they sound very similar. So a skete really is not an organized collection. You'll see a lot of the Irish monks will live around it, and they'll have these huts in random spots around the church. And the monk is mostly alone throughout the day. They'd come in and worship at the church. They also might have food brought. They'll come gather a little bit of food and go back, but they live mostly in their cells. The sayings of the desert fathers and mothers. This is one of the aspects of kind of the fact that you're looking for spiritual wisdom so intently, that sayings begin to arise. It's a collection of sayings about spiritual wisdom, sometimes very insightful, and sometimes too mystical to really be useful. They're put together in a collection called the Philokalia, which is a primary source of spiritual book in Orthodoxy, which is the eastern side of Christianity. Names of Christianity. I'll cover more on that later. So, the sayings of the desert fathers. Give me a word, Abba. I used to say, come and they give me a word. Abba Elias said, for my part, I bear three things: the moment when my soul will leave my body, and when I shall be feared before God, and when the sentence will be given against me. So the last judgment. The old men said of Abba Agathon to Abba Elias in Egypt, he is a good old Abba. The old men answered them, in comparison with his own generation, he is good. They said to him, and what is he in comparison with the ancients? He gave them this answer, I have said to you that in comparison with his generation he is good. But as of the ancients in Skeets, I have seen a man who, like Joshua the son of Nun, could make the sun stand still in the heavens. At these words they were astounded and gave glory to God. Abba Elias, the minister, said, what can sin do where there is penitence? And of what is love where there is pride? Abba Elias said, I saw someone who was carrying a skin of wine on his arm. In order to make the demons blush, for it was a fantasy, I said to the brother, of your charity, take off your cloak. He took off his cloak and was not found to be carrying anything. I say to you that you may not believe even that which you see or hear, even more observe with your thoughts, and beware of what you have in your heart and your spirit, knowing that the demons put ideas into you so as to corrupt your soul by making it think that which is not right, in order to turn your spirit from the consideration of your sins and God. You can see how sometimes they're pithy bits of wisdom, of don't think too highly of yourself or stay the course, and other times they're kind of a little bit on the esoteric side and not nearly as useful. But still an interesting school of spirituality. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It's called the Jesus Prayer, and it's the most popular prayer on kind of northeastern side of Christianity. It began in the Desert Fathers and was recited just constantly. They actually have prayer ropes with little knots on them, and you just say it over and over again, the idea of focusing your mind on God against any temptation that might assail you. Also, the memorization of Psalms would happen. You'd hear it on Sunday, you memorize part of it. Psalm 51 here. Have mercy on me, O my God, according to thy great mercies, and according to thy mercifulness, do away mine offenses. And the image there is of a monk, that's a seraphim, one of the choirs of angels there comforting him. The idea of memorizing prayers, Psalms, was very common. Some of them could actually memorize whole bunches of the whole Psalter, or at least large portions of it. Others only memorized a little bit of it, and that was done to recite to. It was not a deeply intellectual life when the Desert Fathers. It was a life of devotion and of focusing and of prayer and such. Desert mothers often lived in houses in outer Egypt, and some did live in the open desert. The idea of women consecrating themselves to prayer was just as common as men, only they, generally speaking, because they were often weaker in body, they did not go out where they might encounter brigands and such. There were often houses, often their own houses. They would grow up with their parents, and they would decide to become anchorites or desert mothers, and they would build a little house for them on the property, and they would be fed, but they would dedicate their lives the same way that men would. Some of them did go off in the open desert. It was just less they could find a monastery. Because obviously there was the temptation. These poor men out there trying to avoid temptations. The last they need is a woman showing up in the area. And second of all, you had dangers out there still. There's one of, and I don't know that I'm covering him, but Saint Moses, who was a black man who had lived a riotous life, just prostitution and warfare and everything else, converted and became a monk. Took him many, many years to get rid of all the images he had in his head. And at the end, he was in a community of monks, and somebody showed up who was going to kill them all. And St. Moses is like, it's my turn. And he was big enough, he could stand them up. He wouldn't take up sword, he wouldn't kill them, but he could push them off. They ended up killing him, but the other monks were able to flee and save themselves. One example of a desert mother who did go off into the wilderness was St. Mary of Egypt. A very successful prostitute. He entered a church trying to find clients and was stopped at the door by an invisible force. She realized her sinfulness and went alone off into the desert. She lived entirely alone until just before her death. She came out of the desert and met a monk who baptized her, gave her communion, and then she died. So this is kind of the extreme example of it. She's a sinner who wanders off, no confession, no baptism, no nothing. Wanders off in the desert, is all alone for many, many years, and wanders in as an old woman before she dies, comes out, is baptized, and receives communion. This is not the usual case. Most people would live in huts or what have you, and would be nourished by regular sacraments and by what have you. This is just a very famous example. There's a huge devotion to her in Eastern Orthodoxy of St. Mary of Egypt. She actually has a Sunday dedicated to her, but she's a famous case of a woman who was a sinner who converted and lived this kind of extreme ascetical life. Saint Pachomius is the first desert father to create a rule. The problem you had again when you had these men living off in these random areas again, you had people who would give up on it, or they would live, they would not necessarily live very good lives sometimes, or they would quit or what have you. His monks lived in communities, usually connected huts surrounding a church. So this is not the skeet where they're random. These are huts are actually usually with a walkway. It was much, much more organized. This writing is called the cenobium. His monks were called cenobites instead of hermits, and who lived alone or in lauras. Laura is like a crown. You've heard of a baccalaureate, which was a crown of berries. It was a crown. It was a round church in the center. They have a round that where the V shows up because the U falls away in the Greek side because of the Latin influence. But anyway, lavra or lavra, it's the same word. And again, these were much more organized monasteries with huts in a circle around a church. Their lives, they began to work together. They began to eat together, usually keeping silence, but it was much more of an organized kind of life rather than what St. Anthony had done. Now, one of the things is the rise of the fathers. So this is a specific term for a kind of individual. These were bishops who stood up and defended the faith and morals of the church and became standard bearers and examples for the church. Their names and teachings after the scriptures became a go-to source for Christian teaching. What these were they were bishops of local areas who would confront the civil authorities and would confront false teachings and do so in a very public way. Many of them were killed, but not all. But they were very vocal defenders of the faith as the empire was struggling through. Oftentimes, like Arius was a priest. Nestorius, I think, was a bishop. Some of the most famous heretics, actually, were churchmen who went astray and became very proud in their way. And other bishops would stand up and they would have fights. There's actually it's Arius and Saint Nicholas, I think, the famous Santa Claus, where Arius is ready to debate him. Nicholas walks up and just hits him and walks off. What's the meme of I came to pass out presents and smack heretics and I'm out of presents? This picture here is of Polycarp. We covered him last time. I told you Polycarp is a famous early bishop. He was a direct disciple of St. John, of the beloved disciple, and carried off. He actually caused a lot of problem because, for example, John was there when Jesus rose from the dead. He knew exactly which day the resurrection was, and St. John kept the day every year. Well, the church wanted to make it a Sunday, and Polycarp said, no, I know exactly what day he rose from the dead. I want to keep that day. And there was a whole fight. Later on, the church put it to a Sunday and just kept it as whatever. But he actually they wanted to hold by, because he remembered St. John taught him the exact day our Lord rose from the dead. Anyway, Polycarp was an early one. Irenaeus of Lyon was born in Smyrna. He was a disciple of Polycarp. So Polycarp was he becomes a disciple of Polycarp. Irenaeus became Bishop of Lyon, which is a Latin province, and noted for a defense of the faith against Gnosticism. We talked a bit about Gnosticism last time, which was early paganism back in the Roman Empire. The idea of knowledge. You had to have secret knowledge for salvation. Your commoner did not know the way to salvation, and only be buying by induction into this society. Freemasonry has a lot of Gnostic elements to it. You have to be inducted into it, and you get special knowledge and handshakes and special books you can't read unless you're actually in it. Very similar, same kind of an idea. But Irenaeus of Lyon was, again, stood up and very publicly wrote and defended against the ideas of Gnosticism. Cyprian of Carthage, a bishop of North Africa. Cyprian challenged Donatus and the Donatist teachings. Again, Donatism was the belief that there were two sides of it. During the persecutions, if you gave up your faith, you were done. You would never be readmitted to Christianity. You had lapsed in your faith and were unworthy of the name Christian. And the second thing is that the holier you were, the more efficacious your sacraments were as a priest, and the more your prayers were heard as a regular Christian. So if someone's very holy, their prayers are heard a lot. If someone's kind of lukewarm, they don't really hear their prayers. And if you sin, God doesn't listen anymore. So it was a huge heresy, continued on for some time. We're actually going to cover it one more time, Donatism and Arianism, but it's because they become cultural movements as much as they become heresies. That Cyprian of Carthage about the year 200 is North African, where this is a really big thing. Augustine, the next century, is going to go against Donatists also, because they set up their own church. Both Arianism and Donatism will set up their own rival churches, and I'll cover that next time about what the differences were between sort of the Catholic Church and the Donatist or Arian Church. But the Donatists were at this point in time becoming, not only, again, they had this idea of the holier you are, the faster your prayers get to heaven. Priests who are very holy, their sacraments are very efficacious. Priests that are lukewarm, not so. And if a priest sins, masses are invalid, no good at all. So he stood up and fought against these teachings in his time. All right. The next time here, we're going to the Christian Roman Empire. It is impossible to really fathom the 300s in the Christian age. The beginning of the 300s, Diocletian is still in charge, and Christians are persecuted with a violence they'd never seen before. And by the end of the 300s, the Roman Empire is Christian, and it's the pagans being persecuted. The Christianity is the official religion by the end of the century, and it is the pagans who are under persecutions. The creation of the Bible. The scriptures have obviously already been written, but the question of how and when the translations and such, they will finally close the cover on the official scriptures, which we still have today in the 300s. We spoke about the fathers. The 300s into the 4 is really when both spiritually and culturally, the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, is going to say, no, this is what we believe. The creeds, the Bible and everything, and finally come down. And these men are going to stand up and really fight those who would speak against the faith and such. And finally, the barbarians. The Roman Empire is getting weaker and weaker. Sooner or later, you're going to begin to have the Germans, the Celts, the Britons. These various people are going to come in and they're going to begin more and more the fabric of Christendom, of Western and the Eastern, mostly the Western. And they're actually going to begin to get ready to take on the torch as Rome becomes politically and socially and militarily less and less relevant. So the beginning of the 300s is when you're going to see, it's mostly like Britain and the outer areas are the first ones that are going to be taken over by that. It isn't going to get down into, say, France and Italy until much later, 400s and 500s, but it begins in the 300s. Any questions?
So what was the exact date?
I wasn't there.
Well, you said that one didn't.
He did know, but I didn't. He didn't write it down, and I didn't get a chance to meet him. So, yes.
So, with the Christians being persecuted and even being thrown to the lions, were there also people of other pagan religions also from the lions? Like if you were like Mithras, was that
Well, the thing is, if you were, again, not that I know of, primarily because if you were into Mithras, you probably had no idea putting a little pinch of incense to say, yeah, okay, Emperor is divine, but so is Mithras, whereas the Christians couldn't. If putting that incense on there meant that you acknowledged divinity in the emperor, you couldn't do it. Again, a lot of Christians wanted to just like, don't tell anybody I did it, and put a little pinch of incense. It happened, don't kid yourself. It happened. It's why you had a problem with the Donatists. They got so virulent, was because a lot of people were just going up there going like, what's the scene from Army of Darkness? Nicto, clarato, yeah, I said it. I mean, got all the syllables exactly right. Did you put a pinch of the incense? Well, it might have fallen on the fire. A lot of people wanted to do that. They wanted to put that pinch of incense in that church. And again, what the church's reaction in this regard maybe later be seen of, we didn't need to go that far. But at that time, you didn't have that. People who were hardcore and really zealous, especially again this kind of Donatist factor, were going to say, no exceptions. Either you stand up there and die, or you were unworthy of Jesus. He died, and you're not going to die, and you had that. So a lot of it was extremism, and probably didn't need to happen the way it did. But again, the idea is that if you're going, you needed to they needed to recognize that only Jesus was God, and the empire in this regard was incorrect and could not be followed. But again, with Mithras or whatever, what was the Zoroastrian? Thank you. They probably didn't care if they put a pinch of incense to the emperor, because Zorro wouldn't care. They probably could. If you weren't willing to do a pinch of the incense, if you weren't willing to acknowledge, and then you were up for persecution. Very good. All right, thank you.